Lecture number 11. This will be our final lecture in the book of Daniel, and we will be beginning on slide 133. In our previous lecture, we looked at the first 20 verses of Daniel chapter 11, which traces the history of the Jews within the Persian period and the Grecian period from the time of Cyrus the Great all the way to the assassination of Seleucus IV. In chapter 11, verse 20, it mentions the Syrian Greek ruler that would be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. And this is almost certainly Seleucus IV. Now, as we move on into verse 21 and what follows, we will be picking up with the career of Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, is the contemptuous person who is described in verse 21, that Seleucus would be succeeded by a contemptuous person who has not been given the honor of royalty. It's apparent from the amount of material provided about Antiochus that he is really the center of interest for this vision. Earlier, if you go back to chapter 8 in Daniel, he's described as the small horn. And if you look at later Jewish works in the Apocrypha, such as 1 Maccabees chapter 1 and 4 Maccabees chapter 4, he's described as a sinful root or as an arrogant and terrible man. The rightful heir to the Seleucid throne had been Demetrius, which was the son of Seleucus IV, who at the time of his father's death was a hostage in Rome. And so because he was absent from the country, Antiochus IV, who was the younger son of Antiochus III, and in fact Demetrius' uncle, seized the throne. This is the reason that in verse 21 it says that he will not have been given the honor of royalty. So he does not succeed the kingdom simply because he's the son of the previous king, but he seizes the throne in that son's absence. And so, as the text of Daniel reads, he advances to the throne through a combination of intimidation and intrigue. Now, in verses 22 through 24, there are a number of items that are a little more ambiguous historically. But generally speaking, there is agreement that the prince of the covenant is probably Ananias III, who was the high priest in Jerusalem at that time. Ananias was deposed in 175 BC and was eventually executed or assassinated in 171 BC. And so when it says a prince of the covenant will be destroyed, it probably is talking about Ananias III. Then there will be an invasion that is described in verse 24, and this new king, Antiochus IV, will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers ever had done. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers, and he will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. Now, at this point, Palestine has passed under Seleucid control, the Seleucid dynasty in the north. The Ptolemies in Egypt, however, have not given up on regaining it, and so Ptolemy VI begins to mobilize an army. But Antiochus IV, because he had some intelligence reports from his agents in Egypt, he preempted this attempt by a counterstrike, and he overwhelmed the Egyptian army in 170 and 169 BC. And you find this described in verses 25 and 26. It says, with a large army he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. And the king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army. But he will not be able to stand because the plots devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him, and his army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. When you get to verse 27, it describes the negotiating terms between Antiochus IV and Ptolemy VI after this conflict. Each of them would sit together, lying to each other, and each trying to gain an advantage over the other, and each of them without success. And so it says in verse 27 that the two kings with their hearts bent on evil will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. Finally, Antiochus IV is going to return to Syria. At that time, however, he determines that he will interfere in the Jewish affairs in Jerusalem, and he sets his attention, as it says, against the Holy Covenant, which is to say, against the Torah and its prescription for temple worship. So in verse 28 it says, the king of the north, and this is of course Antiochus IV, will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country. His first action against Jerusalem was to sack the city on his way home from Egypt. And so on his way home, he robs the temple, and this violation is described in some detail in 1 Maccabees chapter 1 and 2 Maccabees chapter 5. Then in 168 BC, Antiochus IV renewed his campaign against Egypt. On this occasion, however, his efforts were foiled by the intervention of Roman warships and an order from the Roman Senate that he must withdraw. The Roman warships were just off the coast in the Mediterranean Sea, and I don't think Antiochus IV was expecting them to intervene, but in fact they did intervene. And this is the reference that you find in verses 29 and 30, particularly the reference to Kittim. Kittim in the Hebrew language normally means the islands and coastlands of the Mediterranean, and so in that sense probably includes Rome, who is also in the Mediterranean Sea. So in verse 29 it says, at the appointed time, Antiochus Epiphanes, this is the he of verse 29, he will invade the south again. But this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands, this is the way the New International Version translates it, or ships from Kittim, that is the Mediterranean islands, will oppose him and he will lose heart. And then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So Antiochus is enraged by this unexpected intervention by the Romans, and he vents out his frustration on Jerusalem. In fact, only apostate Jews would be saved, only the ones that were pro-Seleucid. And now would follow the most blasphemous act in post-exilic history. All along, the attitude of the Greek overlords had been to Hellenize their subjects with what they perceived to be the superiority of the Greek culture. And so this time, upon entering Jerusalem, Antiochus' forces desecrated the temple. They forbade all Jewish sacrifice. They outlawed circumcision. They suspended sabbatical and Jewish festival observances. And even worse, they dedicated the temple of the Lord to the Olympian god Zeus and set up an altar to this Hellenized version of Baal within the very temple court itself. It's this altar that Daniel is going to call the abomination that causes desolation in verse 31. So verse 31 says, Antiochus' armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Of course, the abolition of the daily sacrifice is the same thing that is described back in chapter 8, the cessation of the morning and evening sacrifice. Then in verse 31 it says they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. Now this particular expression, the abomination that causes desolation, is an expression that you also find in the Maccabean record in reference to the image of Zeus that was set up in the temple. And you can read about it in the latter part of 1 Maccabees chapter 1 and also in the first part of 2 Maccabees chapter 6. To complicate the situation further, the Jews in Jerusalem were really divided into two factions. The wealthy Jews, probably for reasons of social favor with their Greek overlords, had long been courting Greek mannerisms anyway. And so this sort of Hellenizing party, this party of the Jews that was more favorable toward Greek culture, was bitterly opposed by the Orthodox Jews, the Hasidim meaning the pious ones. And so in chapter 11, verse 32, Daniel speaks of these two groups. He speaks of both the violators of the covenant as well as the people who know their God. And so what it says in verse 32 is, with flattery, Antiochus will corrupt those who have violated the covenant. In other words, he will corrupt those who are pro-Greek. But the people who know their God, that would be the resistors to this Greek culture, will firmly resist him. Those faithful to the Torah were doomed to dreadful persecution. And that persecution is described in considerable detail in 2 Maccabees chapter 6 and chapter 7. Antiochus forced upon them Greek customs, and he, in a number of ways, violated their sensitivities to their own faith in Yahweh. There is a description in one of the passages about the soldiers of Antiochus forcing pork down the gullets of Jews who would resist him. But there was a priest by the name of Mattathias and his sons, of whom the most well-known is Judas Maccabeus. They would preach a message of repentance and faithfulness and guerrilla resistance. And in time, they would rise up and drive out the Syrian Greeks. In the meantime, however, there would be 3 years for the desolating sacrilege that would continue in the temple. But Daniel predicted that there would be a limit to these terrible events. So in verses 33 through 35, it says, "Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered. When they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Some of the wise will stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time." Now, up to this point, there is general agreement between all schools of interpretation regarding Daniel chapter 11. With this closing passage that begins in verse 36, however, there are 2 lines of interpretation that need to be explored concerning the description of what Daniel calls the arrogant king, the king who will magnify himself and do as he pleases. One of those lines of interpretation follows the Maccabean way of reading the book of Daniel and sees nothing in this passage beyond the events of the life of Antiochus IV. The other, which is more futuristic and is largely based upon a passage in the New Testament in the words of Jesus, will see in the arrogant king a prediction of the eschatological Antichrist, who was prefigured, in a sense, by Antiochus IV. One of the things that seems very clear from Jesus' Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, which is also described in Mark chapter 13, is that the phrase abomination of desolation is not exhausted by the events that happened in the 160s BC, because Jesus told his disciples, when you shall see, future tense, when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, and of course that is the exact phrase that is used in Daniel 11:31, Jesus says, then those who are in Judea and Jerusalem should flee the city. Now, Jesus obviously must be talking about something that still was yet to come. And so the expression about the abomination of desolation and the description about the arrogant king apparently is not exhausted in the events of the 160s BC. So with that in mind, then, you should go to slide 134. The Maccabean view stresses continuity between the description that began in verse 21 and goes right on up, as far as they're concerned, through the end of the chapter. And so they see the contemptuous king of verse 21 as also being the arrogant king of verse 36. So they would say that verse 36 through 39 continues to describe the known career of Antiochus Epiphanes. He will do as he pleases. He magnifies himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods, who is Yahweh. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. He'll show no regard for the gods of his fathers, which is sometimes taken to refer to the fact that he does not follow his own ancestral gods from Syria, but he adopts the Roman god of war, Mars. He has no regard for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead, he will honor a god of fortresses. This is often why they think that perhaps he is the worshiper of the god Mars in the Roman pantheon, because Mars is the god of war. The idea that he would spurn his own ancestral god, which would be Tammuz, which is part of the Syrian religion, is then described in this passage. With the aid of this foreign deity, he would continue his aggression against Jerusalem, and he would distribute property in exchange for bribes. As is said in verse 39, he will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god and will be greatly honored, or those who acknowledge him. And he will make them rulers over many people and will distribute the land at a price. This is probably a reference to bribery. Now, up to this point, the things that are described about Antiochus Epiphanes, if in fact this is who it refers to, seem to follow with what we know of his career. All of them find plausible explanations in Antiochus' persecution of the Jews in Jerusalem. But once you get to verse 40 through the end of chapter 11, you have a description of things, none of which correspond to anything we know from the career of Antiochus Epiphanes. In fact, Antiochus staged his final campaign in Persia, not in Egypt, and he will die in Persia in 164 BC. And historically speaking, he did not invade Palestine again. So what about this passage, verses 40 through 45, that says that in the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and he'll storm out with chariots and cavalry and a fleet of ships and so on? The Maccabean view, which often is held by those scholars who do not regard Scripture as inspired, would simply say that the unknown Jew who is writing this sometime in the 160s is now actually trying to predict the future and doing a very bad job of it. They would say that up through verse 39, this unknown Jew has been describing things that have already happened. Granted, he is putting them in the language as though they were prophecy, but the Maccabean view is that this is not really prophecy. This is history in the form of prophecy, or prophecy after the fact. But at verse 40, he actually tries to predict the future, and in fact misses it terribly. So basically, verses 40 through 45 in the Maccabean view are attributed to mistakes of attempting to predict the future, mistaken prophecy, if you will. In any case, these things did not happen. And that, of course, gives rise to the second of the views, which is what I will call the eschatological view, or the futuristic view. This one, of course, is based squarely upon the statement of Jesus, that the abomination of desolation, in some sense, was still future to Jesus' own time, and it was not exhausted by the events that happened in the period of the Syrian Greeks in Jerusalem. One of the key phrases in this is what you find in verse 40, which says, at the time of the end. And then you will find in verse 1 of chapter 12 a secondary reference to that, which is at that time. Now, in the connection of these two verses, verse 40 of chapter 11 and verse 1 of chapter 12, since chapter 12 describes what seems to be the resurrection of the dead and the last judgment, the time of the end in verse 40 is often taken to mean the end of the world. And it is here that it is sometimes supposed that Daniel has taken the figure of Antiochus IV and he has collapsed it into the figure of the eschatological Antichrist. By conflating these two figures, he is showing the parallelism in the way that both of them will blaspheme God. Antiochus IV blasphemed God in the 160s BC. The Antichrist will blaspheme God at the end of the ages. The conflation of two figures in a single prophecy is not particularly unusual. You find a good example of it, for instance, in the promise to David, way back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, that David would have a son who would build God's house and would rule forever. Well, the son who would build God's house, of course, was Solomon, but the son who would rule forever, according to the New Testament, was Jesus. And so, in the scope of a single prophecy, there is brought together the figure of Solomon in the ancient world and the figure of Christ as a long-range fulfillment under the scope of the same prediction. You find a similar thing with regard to Jesus' statements about the destruction of the temple in Matthew 24. Jesus talks about the temple being destroyed and not one stone being left on another. But in that same context, he also talks about the second coming of the Son of Man, who will judge the world and the nations. The sheep and the goats will be divided as a shepherd divides sheep from goats at the last judgment. And so in Jesus' statement, he has brought together both the events of AD 70, when Titus destroyed Jerusalem, and events at the very end of the age, when he will come again. So if that same principle holds true here at the end of Daniel 11, then it ought not to be unduly surprising to find that in the scope of a single prophecy, the prophet Daniel moves from the figure of Antiochus IV all the way to the end of the age to the figure of the Antichrist. Slide 135. So, continuing this line of interpretation of two views, the Maccabean view as opposed to the eschatological view, we look at Daniel chapter 12. In the Maccabean view, the great distress that is described would then refer to the desecration of the temple by Antiochus IV. This would be the time when he would suspend the sacrifice and he would persecute the Jews. And in this particular case, Daniel's people, or your people who are defended by Michael the archangel, Daniel's people would refer to the Jews who were persecuted by Antiochus IV. The deliverance and the resurrection that are described in verses 1, 2, and 3, those who are in distress, they will be delivered, and multitudes that sleep in the dust will awake. This is understood as a metaphor for the triumph of the Maccabees. In the Maccabean view, the description that they will awake from the dust of the earth does not describe the resurrection of the dead at the end of the age. It simply is a metaphor for the Maccabean people rising from the persecution of Antiochus to a time of triumph when they drive him out of the nation. So they would understand this in very historical terms, terms that do not go beyond the 160s BC. The eschatological view, on the other hand, is that the great distress would refer either to Titus' destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 or to the great tribulation at the end of the age that Jesus describes and that you find also described in the Revelation of John. This eschatological view, of course, takes its main anchor point from the fact that Jesus said the abomination of desolation still was yet to come, in some sense. And in this case, Daniel's people, your people, who will be protected by Michael, either refers to the Jewish people at the end of the age, this would be the dispensational take on this passage, or maybe in general to all of the people of faith, which is more along the lines of the Messianic view. But in either case, it refers to people after the time of Jesus, not back in the 160s BC. Furthermore, when in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 12 it says multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to life, some to everlasting contempt, the eschatological view is that this does indeed refer to the resurrection of the dead at the end of the age. It is not metaphorical. It is a quite straightforward, literal description of what will happen at the end of the age when Christ comes a second time. Those who are wise will shine. In other words, they'll be rewarded. And those who are not faithful to God will rise also, but to shame and everlasting contempt. Slide 36. Now, in verse 7, there appears this phrase, time, times, and half a time. This is the same phrase that we saw earlier in chapter 7, in verse 25, time, times, and half a time. Once again, we look at both the Maccabean view and the eschatological view. In the Maccabean view, the time, times, and half a time refers to the period when the temple was desecrated by Antiochus IV. This would be between 168 and somewhere in 164 BC. Now, here's where it gets kind of tricky for the Maccabean view. In verse 11, it has a reference to the 1,290 days. Some of the university scholars who, again, believe that the unknown Jew who wrote this was trying to predict the future but making a bad effort at it, would say that, going back to chapter 8, he originally predicted that the time of the temple's desecration would last for 2,300 morning evenings, which would be 1,150 days. However, when he came to 1,150 days, the temple was still under oppression, and so he had to recalculate. And so in this view, the 1,290 days are essentially a correction to his original prediction. So he flubbed the first prediction, now he tries the second prediction. When he gets to the end of the 1,290 days, he discovers that still the Maccabean revolt has not successfully driven out the Syrian Greeks, and they haven't recaptured the temple. And so he makes yet a third prediction, 1,335 days. This is in verse 12. This again would be a correction. So he initially makes a wrong prediction in chapter 8. He makes another wrong prediction in chapter 12, verse 11. And he attempts a third prediction in chapter 12 and verse 12. Of course, for those who accept Scripture as the inspired Word of God, and the book of Daniel as part of the canon of Scripture, this sort of approach is not acceptable. So we go to the eschatological view, which says that the time, times, and half a time is in fact the period that's described in the Revelation of John. John also uses this phrase more than once in his book, time, times, and half a time. In reading it in the book of Revelation, then, we are reading something that would also happen after the time of Jesus, and so would accord with what Jesus said, that the abomination of desolation is still yet to come. Dispensationalists tend to equate the time, times, and half a time with the last half of Daniel's 70th week in Daniel chapter 9. You may remember that in Daniel 9, the last week of the 490 weeks, or the last of the 70 weeks of the 490 years, the last 7 years, an event happens the last half of the week, or the middle of the week, and that would divide it into 2 3.5-year segments. And so the dispensationalist says that it is the last half of that week that is the time, times, and half a time, and in fact it is the last 3.5 years of human history prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ. Those who are not dispensationalists may also take this as futuristic. Sometimes, however, they will relate it to what happened in Titus' siege of Jerusalem in the 60s AD and the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Titus attacks Jerusalem in 66, and he puts the city under siege for 3.5 years, culminating in the breach of the city walls, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the destruction of the temple. And so some of those within the eschatological view would not necessarily relate this to the very end of the world, but would relate it more to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. But in either case, as I said previously, both of these viewpoints will take the period of time, times, and half a time, and in fact the period of the abomination of desolation, as something that would happen later than the time of Jesus, because of what Jesus himself said. There is much less unanimity among the ones who take the eschatological view regarding the 1,290 days and the 1,335 days. And in fact, for the most part, they take these as cryptic numbers for which, at present at least, there is no satisfactory explanation. They would simply go back to verse 4, in which Daniel is told to close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. In other words, there will not be complete understanding of all of these things until after everything is completed. So with that in view, go, if you will, briefly to slide 137. Through the centuries, going all the way back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, actually, in the early church fathers, and clear up into the modern period, Christians at various times have attempted to correlate the passages in the book of Daniel with passages in the New Testament. Overall, from the time of Daniel all the way through into the New Testament, there are at least 5 major figures that are described. There is the horn in Daniel 7. There is the abomination of desolation in Daniel 11, which Jesus quotes that passage and refers to also in Matthew 24 and Mark 13. There is the man of sin, which is described in 2 Thessalonians 2. There is the Antichrist, which John describes in his 1st and 2nd letters. And finally, there is the beast from the sea that is described in Revelation 13. Now, whether all of these 5 figures refer to the very same thing or not is, of course, debated. and Christians throughout the centuries have speculated about that. Sometimes they have identified all 5 of these figures as referring to what we popularly call the Antichrist: the horn, the abomination, the man of sin, the Antichrist, and the beast. And certainly there are striking parallels between all of these. Other interpreters may not think that they all refer to the same thing, and some of them do not think they refer necessarily to the end of the world, but they might refer to something that happens in the early church period, either in the destruction of Jerusalem or the persecution of Christians in the early centuries before Christianity became a legal religion. But in any case, these are the passages that are often discussed. I'm not going to try to resolve all of those things in this lecture, which takes us quite beyond the book of Daniel itself. But I do want to point out that these are parts of the Bible that are sometimes thought to refer to the same thing, and or at least speculated to whether or not they are parallels. With that, we come to the end of the lectures in Daniel, and the very final slide, slide 138, describes or shows you a photo of the traditional tomb of Daniel, which is in Susa, Iran. I only show this because it is a reference that once in a while you run into, that Daniel is buried in Persia. And whether this is the actual tomb of Daniel or not is very hard to say. This particular shrine is preserved by those of the Islamic faith, who also recognize Daniel as a prophet. And the traditions are not nearly as old as the Jewish traditions that we find going back into the period of the Old Testament. But at least if you hear some reference to the traditional tomb of Daniel in Persia, this is what it is referring to. So with that, I'll bid you leave, and I hope that these lectures in the fascinating and wonderful book of Daniel have been helpful to you. God bless you.